What's up guys, how you doing? Welcome to another video, and today we're talking full frame cameras and we're talking crop cameras. What's the difference between a full frame sensor and a crop sensor? Recently I made a video all about the rumoured specs and the potential release of the Canon R7 mirrorless crop sensor camera. If you've not seen that one yet, you want to go see that first, I'll link it right here, go check it out. But following that video I got quite a few questions about what's the difference, what would be the advantage of having a crop sensor camera. Something like the Canon R6 has a crop mode, so why not just use the crop mode in the Canon R6 to get yourself the extra reach? What does that mean, extra reach from a crop sensor? All questions that I'm going to answer for you today. It is one of the most talked about topics, and it seems as though photographers always kind of strive towards the idea of having a full frame camera. Professional photographers all shoot full frame cameras, right? They would never use crop sensors. Or maybe they would. We'll talk about that later on as well. Before we get into the actual content of the video, I'm going to ask you guys to do two things for me. Number one, hit the like button on the video, hit that thumbs up, because it helps me out loads and loads on my channel, and I really appreciate it. YouTube seems to put a lot of weight behind that like button right now, which is why I ask you to do it. Thank you guys. Think about subscribing if you haven't already. Loads of other videos to come on my channel, which I think you might enjoy. Okay, so look, let's get into this, right? What's the difference between a full frame sensor and a crop sensor? So a camera, for example, that I use, something like the Canon 1DX, this has a full frame sensor. Now, what that means, when people say full frame, they are generally talking about 35mm sensors. The reason being because film cameras traditionally use 35mm film, and that has kind of become the standard size for modern age digital photography. The 1DX actually has a 36mm by 24mm sensor. Generally full frame, something like 35mm by 24mm, that is typically your full frame sensor size. Whereas something like this, another camera that I use, the 7D Mark II. Now this is a crop sensor camera. Now typically Canon crop sensor cameras have a crop factor of 1.6. Some other companies tend to use crop factors of like 1.5, some even sort of 1.3, something like that, but Canon typically 1.6. So what does that mean? What's that 1.6? Well, the 7D Mark II has a sensor that is 22mm by 15mm. That's the size of the sensor in the 7D Mark II. A quick bit of maths will tell you that 22mm times 1.6 is 35.2, 15mm times 1.6 is 24mm. So what that kind of means is that you've got a full frame size sensor zoomed in by 1.6 times, and that gives you the equivalent size smaller sensor in a crop camera. And that's what that crop factor is. It is the factor by which it is smaller than the full frame sensor. So if you were told that a camera had a 1.6 crop factor, you would know roughly that a full frame camera typically has a 35mm sensor. Divide that by 1.6 gives you 22. That roughly gives you the idea of the size of the sensor in your crop camera. Or you could just Google it. That's the easier way. Google it. Now, the piece that people often find a bit more confusing is kind of what does that mean? How does that look when you take a photo? Now, the thing that does not change is the focal length of the lens that you are shooting with. So, for example, if we have something like this, a 50mm lens, whichever camera you use to take a photo with this lens is still looking at that photo the same way. So what it does is it looks at the photo you're taking, it captures the image, and it sends it through the lens exactly the same way, regardless of which camera is on the other end. The difference is that the two sensors capture that image slightly differently. If you look at the front of these two cameras right here, you can see that the sensor on the 1DX is visibly much bigger than the sensor on the 7D Mark II. We already know that because we've done the maths on the numbers. So what happens is the image goes down this 50mm lens and goes onto that 1DX full frame sensor, and it captures the whole picture. Whereas of course if that same image, the exact same size, goes down your 50mm lens onto that smaller sensor, that sensor can only capture the smaller piece because the sensor is a little bit smaller. To demonstrate what I mean, I took a photo of my good friend Tyson right here, took a photo of him using the 1DX, and that photo came out like this. It literally was just a snapshot. In fact, so much of a snapshot that it's not really in focus, but it looks like this. I then took that exact same photo, same settings, the camera was the exact same distance away, both photos taken with the 50mm lens, but with the 7D2 crop sensor camera, the image came out like this. You see, it's kind of zoomed in because the camera only captured that smaller middle piece of the image. Now, just to be clear, when you're looking down your viewfinders of your camera, you see the image that you're going to be capturing. I'm not suggesting that you look through here and you can see a full-size image, but then you don't capture all of it on the sensor. Of course, what you see through your camera is what you're going to capture, but it is a cropped version view of the actual image that you are looking at. So what that means is that different focal lengths behave differently on a crop sensor camera than they do on a full frame camera. If you take the photo like we did with a 50mm lens, you get your image, whereas of course the crop sensor is actually showing you a kind of more zoomed in image, and that's what people are talking about when they talk about the extra reach that you get from a crop sensor camera. As we've kind of established, it's not actually extra reach, it's kind of theoretical because it is capturing a more zoomed in version of that same picture. It's not quite as simple as that though, and we'll get onto that in just a minute. But what that means is when you're using your 50mm lens with the crop sensor camera, then it's behaving more like an 80mm lens because it is showing that slightly zoomed in 1.6 crop factor effects. 50mm times 1.6 gives you 80. So on the 7D Mark II or crop sensor camera, the 50mm lens behaves more like an 80mm lens. And that works with every lens. So something like a zoom lens, the Canon 70-200. On the crop sensor camera, that would behave more like a 112mm to 320mm lens. If you have a 400mm lens and you use that on a crop sensor camera with a 1.6 crop factor, 400 times 1.6, 640mm. It would behave like a 640mm lens. It doesn't mean it's doing exactly the same thing as a 460mm lens, but it is behaving like one when it's on the 7D Mark II in terms of the image that it is capturing for you. So that's what I mean by theoretical reach, right? People kind of talk about the extra reach you get with the crop sensor camera. It's kind of theoretical because it's almost like a zoomed in picture. And that's where the question always comes from. Well, then what's the difference between using a crop sensor camera or using a full frame camera and then afterwards in your editing process just crop in that image from the full frame camera? Is it exactly the same as using the crop sensor camera in the first place? The honest answer is yes and no. It kind of is the same, yes. If you shoot that wide photo like we did at Tyson and I'd cropped it in so it came out the same as the photo from the 7D Mark II, I would have the same effect, right? I've taken a full frame image and I've cropped it, much like the camera is doing. It's looking at that image and it's capturing it in a cropped format. So I suppose in a lot of ways, yes, it is the same, but the difference is pixel density. So to explain that a little bit further, the 7D Mark II has a sensor that is 20 megapixels. The 1DX has a sensor which is 18 megapixels. So if I take a photo with my 7D Mark II, I'm getting an image that is 20 megapixels worth, 20 megapixels coverage in that photo. If I take a photo with my 1DX, of course I get the full frame, the 18 megapixels worth of information, but then the problem is, when I cut it down, I am trimming away pixels, so you actually get more pixel density with the crop frame camera than you do with the full frame camera that is then cropped in. Now, of course, that wouldn't always apply. Some full frame sensors have huge sensors, like 45 megapixels, so even when you crop them down, you still end up with more resolution than if you had something like the 7D Mark II. But when you're using cameras which are similar size sensors, then there is an important point. One of the questions I got asked after I made that R7 video was, well, why don't people just use the R6 and shoot it in crop mode? The Canon R6 has a crop mode where you can shoot with a 1.6 crop. The problem is pixel density. Now, right now, there's lots of different rumours about what kind of sensor the R7 might have, but a lot of people are suggesting it might have the sensor around 20 megapixels. So if it does, people take a photo with that R7, they will get a photo, 20 megapixels coverage on that sensor will be the photo that you get. If you use the Canon R6, which has a 20.1 megapixel sensor, and you take that photo, but then you crop it down to the equivalent crop factor of 1.6 that the R7 is likely going to have, the problem then is that the resolution of that equivalent crop frame sensor that you're left with is only 7.8 megapixels. And actually 7.8 megapixels, it is a lot more valuable than a lot of people might think. You can still do a lot with 7.8 megapixels, but it would be nowhere near the same level of pixel density as you would get with something like an R7, which will likely have a sensor of maybe 20 megapixels or perhaps even more. So hopefully that helps people understand the difference between an actual crop sensor camera and then a full frame camera that you crop down to be the equivalent type of image. Well, so what are the benefits of the full frame sensor then? And the answer is, well, there's quite a lot. One of the big differences is that full frame sensors tend to perform a lot better in low light situations than crop sensors do. Whilst this is sometimes a little bit hard to understand, it's actually fairly straightforward. If you imagine a sensor the size of the 7D Mark II, 22mm by 15mm, and of course you've got 20 megapixels within that smaller sensor. Whereas the 1DX, you've got the bigger 36mm sensor, and you've got 18 megapixels within that size frame. So what that means is that each pixel can be a lot bigger. And that means because it's bigger, it has more ability to absorb light, making it much better at shooting in low light conditions. That's why often crop sensor cameras tend to not perform so well in low light conditions. Anybody who knows these two cameras, you will know that the 7D Mark II does not perform as well in low light as the 1DX. If you shoot this at ISO 6400, then you shoot this at ISO 6400, you will get a lot more grain and noise and unfortunately poorer image quality in this crop sensor camera. That very same reason is why the Canon R6 performs better in low light than the Canon R5, because the R5 has a much bigger sensor, a lot more megapixels, therefore they're more squashed in, less space per pixel. And that means it doesn't do quite as well in low light as the Canon R6. Something which people always struggle to understand. They think, well, the R5 is better in almost every other way, why does it not perform as well in low light? The difference is small, by the way, but it is there, and that's why. For the very same reason, full frame cameras tend to provide more finer detail within images, which then means that they can have much better dynamic range, performing better in different lighting conditions, and overall your image quality generally tends to be better with full frame cameras than it does with a crop sensor. And those last few points that we just talked about there, that is why generally people aspire to a full frame camera, because the image quality, generally speaking, can be better. The other reason is that a lot of the higher end or professional lenses, of course, are designed to go on full frame cameras. Something like the Canon 24 to 70mm, which I'm shooting this video on right now. That is a focal length which is really, really good. But of course, it's designed to go on a full frame camera. That range of 24mm wider into 70mm, if I want to get a bit closer, works really well. But the problem is, if I put that onto a crop sensor, that 24mm then starts to behave more like, what would that be, nearly a 40mm lens, which doesn't give you that same wider view. That's why there are lots of companies which make specialist crop sensor lenses. On my 7D Mark II, I used the Sigma 18 to 35, which was fantastic because that 18mm kind of looked and had the feel and behaved like almost a 24mm lens. That 18 to 35 then kind of behaves almost like a 28 to 60mm-ish lens, very similar to that 24-70. And so a lot of the higher end professional grade lenses are designed for full frame cameras. Another big difference between the two is the price. Again, relating to a lot of what we've been talking about, the full frame cameras tend to be more expensive. That's why the Canon R7 price point will be really interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see how it compares with the R6. You have to assume it will have a cheaper price point than the R6, but how much? It might be a very similar price, it might be a little bit less, or who knows, it could be quite a good bit less, which is why it might become a really attractive camera for a lot of people. So lastly, but certainly not least, does that mean if you want to shoot professional work, you have to have a full frame camera? No, certainly it doesn't. There are an awful lot of pros out there who use crop sensor cameras. And actually, you know what? If the R7 ends up being as good as it is rumoured to be, I think there will be even more professionals using crop sensor cameras. Some of the previous pro body cameras, like the 1D series, actually did have slight crop sensors. I believe the 1D Mark IV, I think, had a 1.3 crop, and actually that's totally fine. I did loads of my professional work when I first started out in sports using a pair of 7D Mark IIs. Both had a 1.6 crop factor. Provided you're using suitable lenses and provided you're working on the rest of your image quality and getting your exposure right and everything like that, arguably it makes no difference at all. You're not going to look at a photo and think, oh, that was shot with a crop sensor. You're going to look at a photo and decide whether or not it's good or not. Was it composed right? Was it exposed correctly? That's what counts when it comes to deciding, is a photo good enough for a professional level, not which camera you're shooting it with. So, I hope that helped people to understand the differences between a full frame camera and a crop sensor camera. Those are the main ones. Of course, there's other differences as well. If you guys think you've got anything out there that maybe I missed, perhaps something I didn't talk about, do me a favour, whack it in the comments, because it could be really useful for other people. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, do me a favour, hit the like button on the video. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next video.